Picture this. Across the industrial backbone of Europe, Germany's precision engineering valleys, Italy's manufacturing heartland, Spain's sprawling production zones, a sound is echoing that wasn't meant to exist for another generation. Complete silence. The mechanical symphony that has defined European industry for over a century has suddenly gone quiet. Robotic arms designed to assemble tomorrow's vehicles now stand frozen. Production lines engineered to churn out millions of cars annually have transformed into empty corridors of steel and concrete. This is December 2025. And well, something fundamental just broke. Act 1. The collapse. The numbers tell a story that corporate press releases try to hide. Stellantis, the automotive behemoth controlling Peugeot, Fiat, Jeep, and a dozen other household names, didn't just slow production. They hit pause entirely for multiple weeks. Volkswagen, the very symbol of German industrial might, slashed entire shifts from their schedules. Ford's European operations announced workforce reductions that rippled across the continent. But here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. Europe's car factories are operating at barely 50% capacity. Let me translate what that actually means on the ground. These aren't flexible facilities that can easily scale up and down. These are multi-billion euro investments, precision-tuned ecosystems employing hundreds of thousands of people. When a factory built to produce 2 million vehicles a year suddenly builds only 1 million, it doesn't just lose money, it hemorrhages it. Industry analysts are now tracking 8 major automotive plants across Europe that have moved from temporary closure to permanent shutdown evaluation. These aren't regional assembly shops. These are landmark facilities, some operating continuously since the 1960s, now facing extinction. This isn't your typical economic downturn where demand softens and rebounds. This is structural collapse. The ground beneath an entire industry has given way, and what comes next looks nothing like what came before. Act 2. The surrender. And then, European leaders made a choice that will define this era. For nearly a decade, one policy stood as the untouchable cornerstone of Europe's climate ambition: the 2035 ban on new internal combustion engine vehicles. This wasn't just legislation, it was a declaration. Europe announcing to the world that it would lead humanity's transition away from fossil fuels, consequences be damned. Politicians staked their legacies on it. Environmental groups rallied behind it. It was supposed to be the immovable object that forced the entire global automotive industry to transform. In December 2025, the European Commission officially recommended abandoning it. Not adjusting it, not delaying it, scrapping it entirely. In its place, a convoluted 90% emissions reduction target, riddled with exemptions and flexibility mechanisms that industry insiders immediately recognized as loopholes wide enough to drive a diesel truck through. Now pay close attention to the language European officials used. They didn't talk about environmental science. They didn't cite new climate data. The official justification came down to 2 phrases that should haunt every policymaker involved: business-friendly environment and competitive pressures. Translation: we're losing, and we're changing the rules to stop the bleeding. This wasn't policy evolution. This was capitulation. A humiliating retreat dressed up in diplomatic language. Brussels looked directly at its own rulebook, the regulations it spent billions crafting and enforcing, and threw them out the window because the alternative was watching its industrial foundation crumble in real time. History will record this as one of the most dramatic policy reversals of the 21st century. A white flag raised not on a battlefield, but in a conference room, and it confirmed a truth that many suspected, but few wanted to admit out loud. Europe's grand vision for green industrial leadership had just collided headfirst with geopolitical reality, and reality won. Act 3. The competitor. So what force was powerful enough to make Europe abandon its defining climate policy? To understand that, you need to completely reframe how you think about this competition. This was never about which company makes a cheaper electric sedan. This was about two fundamentally different philosophies of economic power colliding on a global stage. While European policymakers spent the 2010s in endless debates, setting emission targets, negotiating compromise deadlines, balancing environmental groups against industrial lobbies, China was executing something entirely different. Not a policy, a campaign. The Chinese approach wasn't designed in legislative chambers. It was architected as integrated industrial warfare. The government didn't just subsidize car companies. They orchestrated an entire ecosystem from the ground up. Strategic state funding secured lithium mines in South America and Africa before most Western analysts even understood lithium's importance. They constructed battery gigafactories on a scale Europe never attempted. They created domestic demand through subsidies and restrictions that guaranteed millions of Chinese consumers would buy electric vehicles, providing the market volume that makes innovation profitable. Think of it like this. Europe was focused on writing the rulebook for a race. China was building the racetrack, the cars, the fuel stations, and recruiting the drivers. And the results? They're not hidden in classified reports. They're in your local car dealership. Act 4. The Takeover. Late 2025 provided a moment so symbolic it deserves to be remembered as a historical marker. In the United Kingdom, birthplace of automotive culture in Europe, home to brands that once defined luxury and engineering excellence, a Chinese SUV called the Leapmotor C10 outsold the Volkswagen Tiguan. Read that again. A vehicle from a brand that barely existed in European consciousness 5 years ago just beat one of the continent's most established nameplates on its home turf. This isn't an anomaly. It's a trend line accelerating so fast that industry forecasters are scrambling to update their models. Current projections suggest Chinese automotive brands will capture double their current European market share by 2030. We're talking about going from peripheral players to commanding potentially 20 to 25% of the entire EU car market within 5 years. Every percentage point Chinese manufacturers gain represents billions in revenue European companies lose. More critically, it represents engineering talent that shifts allegiance, supply chain relationships that get rewired, and consumer loyalty that, well, just evaporates. This is what a strategic conquest looks like in the modern era. No territorial claims, no military confrontation, just superior products arriving in shipping containers, consumers making rational economic choices, and an industrial base slowly realizing it's been outmaneuvered. European automakers aren't just losing market share. They're watching their home markets become the battleground where their own survival will be decided. Act 5. The global gambit. But zoom out, because the real story was never confined to automobile showrooms. The torrents of capital flowing from electric vehicle dominance have given China something far more valuable than profit margins: geopolitical leverage at a scale that's reshaping global power dynamics. Watch what's happening in Latin America. Historically considered America's sphere of influence, the region where U.S. diplomatic and economic power was simply assumed as a constant. That assumption is crumbling. Flush with revenue and industrial confidence, Chinese state-backed entities are dramatically expanding their presence across South and Central America. The focus? Resource-rich nations that possess exactly what the next century of industrial competition requires. Venezuela, despite, or perhaps because of, its complicated relationship with Washington, has become a focal point. Deepening discussions around oil extraction, critical mineral mining, and infrastructure development represent more than trade deals. They represent a strategic repositioning. The playbook is elegant in its simplicity. China offers capital, technology, and industrial partnership. In return, it secures long-term access to raw materials essential for battery production, renewable energy systems, and advanced manufacturing. Plus, it gains diplomatic allies willing to support its positions in international forums. This isn't imperialism in the 20th century sense. It's influence traded for investment, and it deliberately complicates America's strategic position by building economic dependencies in its own hemisphere. The electric vehicle trade war has become the funding mechanism for a much broader contest over global influence, and one side is playing with house money. Act 6. The Backfire. Now, you might reasonably think, surely Europe and America saw this coming and responded appropriately. Surely massive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles would halt this advance? You'd be wrong. And what happened instead is almost darkly poetic. The tariff barriers, designed as defensive walls to protect domestic industries, didn't just fail to stop Chinese manufacturers. They inadvertently supercharged them. Here's why. When faced with a 25 to 40% tax penalty at the border, Chinese automakers had a choice: retreat or adapt. They chose adaptation with such strategic brilliance it should be taught in business schools for decades. Strategy 1. Geographical arbitrage. Why pay tariffs when you can simply move production inside the tariff wall? BYD is constructing a massive manufacturing facility in Hungary. Chery is establishing operations in Spain. These aren't token assembly plants. They're full-scale production centers employing Europeans, sourcing from European suppliers, and completely bypassing the tariffs while simultaneously becoming local companies that make protectionist policies politically complicated. The defensive wall accidentally became an invitation to set up permanent residence. Strategy 2, and this is even more consequential, forced evolution. When tariffs eliminated the ability to compete purely on price, Chinese manufacturers had to justify premium pricing through undeniable quality and technology. The result? Accelerated innovation in exactly the areas where European brands thought they had permanent advantages. We're now seeing Chinese EVs with autonomous driving features that rival or exceed anything from German luxury brands. Interior technology that makes traditional dashboards look medieval. Battery systems that charge in minutes rather than hours and deliver ranges that eliminate anxiety. The pressure of tariffs didn't crush these companies. It refined them into premium competitors. The West's most aggressive defensive measure didn't stop the invasion. It upgraded the invaders. Act 7. The Heart of Europe. Return with me to where we began. That silent factory floor somewhere in Europe. With its automotive sector in retreat, its flagship climate policy abandoned, and its competitive advantages eroding, we must confront an uncomfortable question. What remains? This isn't about a single struggling industry. The automotive sector represents something close to Europe's industrial soul. It accounts for roughly 14 million direct and indirect jobs across the continent. It's the anchor for thousands of specialized suppliers, engineering firms, and research institutions. It's a century of accumulated expertise, pride, and identity. If this cornerstone crumbles, what withstands the pressure? The nightmare scenario keeping European policymakers awake isn't a dramatic single collapse. It's something slower and more insidious managed decline. A gradual exodus of not just factories, but talent. The best battery chemists accepting offers from Chinese firms. Software engineers specializing in autonomous systems relocating to where those systems are actually being deployed at scale. The accumulated knowledge base, the institutional wisdom that takes generations to build, evaporating as individual experts make rational career decisions. Once that expertise departs, history suggests it doesn't return. You can rebuild factories with enough capital. You cannot easily rebuild an ecosystem of knowledge. The risk is an economic hollowing out. Europe potentially transforming from an industrial powerhouse into primarily a consumption market, importing the advanced technologies it once pioneered, assembling products designed elsewhere, becoming economically dependent on systems it doesn't control. Act 8. The Fracture. But step back even further. Because what's happening in European automotive plants is actually a symptom of something far larger breaking apart. For roughly 3 decades following the Cold War's end, the global economic order operated on a foundational assumption: convergence. The idea that increased trade and interconnection would naturally create shared rules, common standards, and mutual prosperity. That everyone would play the same game, and that game would make everyone richer. The electric vehicle conflict has obliterated that assumption. What we're witnessing is the final fracturing of the single global system into competing spheres of influence, each with its own rules, standards, and strategic objectives. There's the US-led bloc, increasingly focused on friendshoring and domestic industrial policy. Hundreds of billions poured into the Inflation Reduction Act to rebuild American manufacturing capacity. The message: we will subsidize our way back to competitiveness, and only allies who align with our broader strategic interests get access. There's the China-centric network, built on its own technical standards, supply chains deliberately insulated from Western disruption, and a patient long-term strategy for technological self-sufficiency. And caught between them? Europe. Wealthy but strategically confused. Powerful on paper but struggling to translate that power into industrial outcomes. Attempting to maintain relationships with both spheres while building its own capacity and succeeding at none of them decisively. The objective has fundamentally changed. It's no longer about growing a shared economic pie. It's about control, security, and ensuring your bloc possesses the critical infrastructure for the future. The semiconductor fabs, the battery production, the rare earth processing, the data centers. The playbook where Europe could simply set superior regulations and expect the world to adopt them? Obsolete. Quaint, even. We've entered the era of economic nationalism dressed in the language of security, where technology is the primary weapon system, and where the only rule is securing your own supply chains before someone else does. Act 9. The fatal flaw. So how did Europe, with all its wealth, education, research capacity, and historical industrial prowess, end up in this position? The answer is a mismatch so fundamental it borders on tragedy. Europe's strategy was built on Enlightenment principles. Craft the most sophisticated regulatory framework humanity has ever seen. Set bold environmental targets backed by moral authority. Create market incentives through carefully balanced policy. Trust that superior rules would naturally produce superior outcomes. It was governance as aspiration, policy as philosophy. The fatal error was assuming that writing the rulebook meant you'd automatically build the technology, that declaring a green future was equivalent to securing a green future. Europe designed its electric vehicle transition in conference rooms, negotiated through committee compromises, refined through democratic processes. This produced elegant policy documents. It did not produce battery gigafactories at competitive scale. Meanwhile, China approached the exact same technological transition as integrated economic warfare. State support wasn't debated, it was deployed. Resource acquisition wasn't left to market forces, it was strategically secured. Market creation wasn't hoped for, it was mandated. Every element, financing, supply chains, consumer demand, technical standards, operated as parts of a unified machine directed toward a single objective: dominance. European regulators sat in Brussels. European industrialists sat in Munich, Turin, and Paris. Those two groups communicated, certainly, but they operated in fundamentally separate spheres with different incentives and timelines. That separation wasn't a minor organizational problem. It was a strategic vulnerability that a more integrated competitor exploited with surgical precision. Europe brought noble intentions to an industrial knife fight. The outcome was predictable. Closing, the new map. Which brings us to the unavoidable conclusion. The surrender of the 2035 combustion ban is not primarily about cars. It's a single, crystalline lesson in how power actually functions in the 21st century. The maps that strategists studied for generations, showing military bases, naval routes, oil fields, and territorial boundaries, are becoming decorative artifacts. The map that matters now is invisible to satellites, but utterly definitive. It traces global lithium flows. It marks the locations of battery production facilities. It follows the patents for next-generation solid-state energy storage. It tracks the data centers processing information from billions of connected devices. It identifies who processes rare earth minerals and who controls the supply chains that turn raw materials into finished technology. This is the real empire, not land, not even capital in the traditional sense, but control over the systems that enable everything else. We're watching the global order reorganize itself into three distinct archetypes: the producer, the bloc that actually manufactures the future, that possesses the supply chains, the technical expertise, and the industrial capacity to turn resources into advanced technology at scale. Currently, one player dominates this category in ways that should alarm every strategic thinker in Washington and Brussels: the consumer regulator. Wealthy, sophisticated, capable of setting standards and rules, but increasingly dependent on others to actually build the physical infrastructure of the future. Influence declining in proportion to industrial capacity. This is Europe's current trajectory, and America's potential future if current trends continue. The protectionist innovator. The bloc betting massively on rebuilding domestic capacity through state intervention, willing to abandon free trade orthodoxy to secure strategic independence. It's unclear if this strategy will succeed, but the commitment is total. The automotive crisis in Europe is our clearest signal yet that the post-Cold War consensus has completely disintegrated. The race isn't just about inventing the next breakthrough technology. It's about owning the entire ecosystem that technology requires to function. From raw materials to manufacturing to consumer markets to technical standards. And right now, as European factories stand silent and Chinese production lines hum with activity, one player is writing the next chapter of industrial history. Not with speeches about climate leadership, not with regulatory frameworks, however elegant, but with the quiet, relentless efficiency of functional supply chains delivering superior products to global markets. The question that remains, the one that will define the coming decades, is simple. Can the rest of the world figure out how to compete in this new game before the outcome becomes permanent? The clock is running, and as those silent European factories remind us, time doesn't stop just because you're still figuring out the rules.